All right, and welcome back to the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. Today's episode is going to be a little different than what we usually do. So I'm just going to give you the bottom line up front. We're going to talk about the warrior ethos and really where it comes from. And I do believe that this is going to be a treatment of this topic, a conversation that you have never had before, that you've probably been exposed to for the first time. So hear me out as I get to it. So talking about the warrior ethos, most people, when you hear the word or the phrase warrior ethos, or when people are talking about it on the interwebs and whatnot, it's usually like a practical code, right? A set of virtues. So things like, acting with honor, courage, loyalty to your comrades, discipline, honor, that kind of stuff. Stuff that will help you accomplish the mission and keep your people alive. It's useful, it's battle tested, it's good. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't have a gripe with that at all. But I think there's something much deeper to it than that. And here's my theory. I think it goes way further than that. I think the people, if we look at warrior cultures in the past, like going back thousands of years ago, I think that these people who actually lived by these things believed that they were touching upon something much bigger than themselves every time that they held on to one of these virtues or exercised them. And I'm not talking about metaphorically either. I'm talking about actually participating in the divine. That's the claim. And I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm going to walk you through the evidence, starting with the Norse god who traded his own eye for wisdom, a different one who paid with his own hand in order to keep the world from falling apart. And by the end, you'll be able to judge for yourself whether the theory holds up. And here's why I'm doing this. It's not just out of historical curiosity, because if I'm right, and I think I am, but if I'm right, it means something about what we lost when we turned these virtues into just a simple self-help checklist. And I think it also means something about how it is that we get them back. So let's get into it. We're talking about the warrior ethos, the path of the dangerous man. We're starting right now. Recorded live from a undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. So if you're still hanging with me from that, we're talking about the warrior ethos and really the origins of it and how I think it's grounded into something much, much deeper. Let me tell you how I caught on, or how I got onto this in the first place, because it has very, I think, implications for the way we live our lives, especially if you're on the warrior path. So, let's go back to the warrior ethos. This is how a lot of conversations go. Like I said at the beginning, somebody's rattling off a list of courage, honor, discipline, loyalty. Maybe they also talk about things like integrity, resilience, service, all that stuff, all good stuff. It's a good list. Nobody's arguing that those things aren't worth having. But quick vocabulary check before we go forward, because I'm going to lean on this word a whole lot this episode, and that's ethos. What is an ethos? We toss it around like it's just values or some kind of vibe, but it's more specific than that. So an ethos isn't just what a group says it believes, right? It's not like a creed. It's what a group actually becomes through years of repeated practice. It's the expectation. It's the consequence, like, of your actions, what you do, what you're rewarded for, what you're disciplined for within the group. And every institution has one. Like, your unit has one, whether it's articulated or not. The military services have one. Police departments each have one. Your school has one. Your family has one. All of them, right? And so then when we talk, all of that has an ethos, right? The warrior ethos then is specific to like that caste or that group of people. It's what happens when a society takes a group of people capable of serious violence and has their bind their actions to an obligation, even when no one's watching. Like, skill you can teach a month, but the kind of character, right? That kind of character that the society places the expectations upon the warriors, that takes a lifetime to build. And the ethos is the way that you help shape them. But when you ask where this list actually comes from, Like, where does it come from? Why are those virtues and attributes there in the ethos? Right. Some people, especially if they're just some kind of materialist or humanist, are going to say, well, that's just what a warrior is. Like, the pairing is always obvious and always inevitable. Like, courage and violence just naturally go together, like bread and ham in a sandwich, right? And case closed. But it's really not that simple. The easier answer is, well, good soldiers happen to have this trait. So over time, we just noticed the pattern, and then it got written down in doctrine, right? Simple, intuitive, good to go. But I think that is an explanation for it, and I think it may be true to a certain extent. But I think it goes deeper than that, because tactics will answer the question of how do I prevail in a fight, but it doesn't touch on the harder question of what kind of person should hold that power in the first place. Because history is stacked with men who were terrifyingly good at violence, but also terrible human beings, right? Like warlords, tyrants, guys who had all the skill in the world, but none of the restraint. So skill does not create character, right? You could be an elite tier one person, a tier one dude, and still not have the character. A lot of them do, but not everybody does, because the skills just amplify whatever character is there. So the better you get at applying force, the more your character matters, not less. It becomes more important. Because that realization sent me kind of going backwards into history and asking a different question of not how did these ancient warriors fight, but why did their societies insist that they be a certain kind of person before they entrusted them with that kind of power? Right? And it's important because the society, if they're not careful, right, they entrust these men, this war band, with the tools and the training of violence and power, and you have to make sure that these guys don't turn around and use it against you, which sometimes happen. And so I was like, well, and that's where the warrior ethos comes from, right? This ethos to try to shape and mold these beings into violent tools of violence, but controlled tools of violence for the benefit of society. And here's the part that kind of surprised me is as I look back into these different cultures, right? Everything from the Vikings to the Anglo-Saxons to the Romans and Greeks, even off to the samurai of Japan, right? You get different gods, different myths, different stories, different culture, and different rule books, but the same virtues showing up again and again, with places that had next to no contact with each other or limited contact over centuries or even geography. And yet you still see these same things: courage, discipline, loyalty, honor, right? The ability to endure hardship without falling apart, right? Strength that knows how to go all in, but also knows how to or when to hold back, and keeping your word even when it costs you something, right? And I think that's just too consistent to be a coincidence. And so again, the first instinct, right, is the practical one, right? Every society deals with war. War selects for certain traits. So of course you're going to see an overlap. And that is true, and we'll come back to that. But it doesn't explain everything, because these societies didn't just train these traits. They didn't just instill it into their guys. They venerated them. They enshrined them. They worshiped them. And they wrapped them in stories that outlasted every army and every empire that held on to them. Right. So let me give you a taste of what I mean. Right. Instead of just kind of talking around about it, let me just kind of give you some examples. I'm going to give you some quotes that come out of the lore of our ancestors that are just badass and cool, right? Let's just start with the Norse sagas, for instance, because those are the ones I'm more familiar with. You may or may not have heard this. This comes out of different sagas and different poems, but here's one of my favorites. Quote, "Though dying, an eagle should bear its claws," right? That's unquote. Just that idea of even to the, you resist, you endure, you fight, no matter the cost, no matter whether it's lost or not, you never give up, right? Even in death, you are still defiant. You are defiant in the jaws of death, right? Sounds cool. Or how about this one? This one's from the Volsung saga. Fear not the day of your death, because your doom is set and none can escape it. Man, doesn't that sound badass? And then, of course, another one that I'm going to paraphrase. Can I even talk today? Better to die free than to live on your knees. We've heard things like that, right? That's definitely comes out of a warrior ethos kind of mind, a warrior mindset, so to say. And then often one of my favorites for what would a podcast be if I didn't mention Beowulf? From Beowulf, the Old English epic, quote, fate will often spare a man if his courage holds, unquote. And I'm that too is a paraphrase. I prefer the way that Michael Crichton put it in the 13th Warrior, right? Clear and succinct. Fate will often spare a man if his courage holds. Like guys read lines like this, man, and they want them tattooed on themselves. They put it on T-shirts. I've seen these quotes before on T-shirts. I've seen them memes all over the internet, right, to inspire people. They're cool, right? They hit hard. They hit on something real. There's something, especially if you're in the warrior path, you read these things and there's something on a cellular level where this resonates. It feels right. It feels something like you want to aspire to, right? It gets you motivated and to want to do great things. But here's what I think most people miss. Maybe I missed it for the longest time, is the reason why these lines hit as hard as they do. It's not just because it's tough talk. It's the same spirit that is sitting inside these quotes, is the same spirit that is running throughout the myths and the religion that these warriors of old participated in themselves. So the fate that spares the courageous man in Beowulf is the same fate that Odin is bargaining with when he trades his own eye for wisdom. We'll talk about that later. These one-liners aren't separate from the mythology and the religion. They are the mythology and the religion that are compressed down into a statement, into some, or an aspect of it, right, that is compressed down into something that a man can say out loud right before he goes and does something hard, right? These virtues then didn't start in a training manual. They start in the myth and also encoded in the religion itself. And that's strange if you think about it, especially to modern ears. Why would a society take its high standards of how a human being should behave, or at least a warrior should behave, and bury it inside stories that are about gods and monsters? And to answer that, we've got to get clear on what people actually thought a myth was back then. All right. So a quick word on a practical case first, because it's real and worth having in view. Every civilization that lasts needs force, right? Somebody capable of violence on behalf of everybody else. And that creates an ugly problem that I that I alluded to earlier, right? The same qualities that make a man effective at violence are the qualities that make him dangerous to the people he's supposed to protect. So in the past, every culture that survived long enough to solve that equation somehow, right, did so through the ethos, right? The Spartans did it through the agoge, the Roman through his sense of civic duty, the Germanics. And if you don't know what I mean by that word, I'm talking about the Germanic tribes as a whole. So I'm talking about the continental Germans, Scandinavians, Saxon England, Iceland, like all of that. Even the Netherlands, like those are Germanic people, all one people at one time, right? That split off into these various tribes. The Japanese had the Bushido. We even, in a sense, we've preserved a bit of it in the modern military, like through our doctrine, through laws, right? The same things like that. So it's different machinery just doing the same job. And that explains why societies needed like some system. But it doesn't explain why. Almost without exception, the system that emerged got wrapped up into myth instead of staying inside of a training manual. So if the warrior ethos was purely a practical fix, you'd expect it to get you'd just pass down through training, right? Through laws, through codes of conduct. And those did exist. Those did happen. But they were rarely the main way that the deepest expectations got transmitted, at least back in the ancient world. right? Instead, they got transmitted and carried through in stories in the myth and encoded into the religion itself. And here's where we are as a modern people. We get tripped up because we file the word myth, quote unquote, under fiction, something that is entertaining, something that's just culturally cool or interesting, but not real in any meaningful sense. And ancient societies didn't see it that way at all, because to them, myth wasn't fiction as we see fiction, right? It was a form of truth, not necessarily literal truth, right? We've got plenty of evidence that some of these cultures didn't necessarily look at their myths and say this literally happened exactly the way it was described, and the way that a Christian may read the Bible, right? But true in the sense that it revealed the actual structure, the cosmic structure of the world that they were living in. So let's hang on tight, because now we're about to get knee deep in it, right? And this is where I'm putting the bulk of my thesis, right? That I want you to listen to, and this may warp your mind if you've not been exposed to this before. So listen close, guys. So there's a historian of religion named Mircea Eliade. It's worth knowing his name. I'll put a couple of his books down in the links below, right? They're worth reading and rereading if you are interested. If you are still listening now, and if you make it to the end of this and you're like, oh my God, there's something real to this, then you definitely want to read the books that I'm going to put in the show notes below. But it's worth knowing his name because he spent his entire career studying exactly this. And he's the one that pointed out that in a lot of traditional societies, myths were treated as an accounts of original events, right? The acts that turned raw chaos into order, right? The moment the world became the world as we know it, and not just like bedtime stories about the past, but explanations for why the present still holds together. And this is where I want to slow down, because it's going to get really weird to the modern mind. And I think it's worth getting weird with it and the strangeness instead of just rushing past it. So Eliade uses this Latin phrase called Iliad Tempus, right? Which means, quote, that time, unquote, right? That time. I don't think it's exact. I don't think it's a 1-for-1 match, but if you know anything about Plato and Platonic forms, it's kind of like that, right? In my mind. And it refers to a kind of time that isn't part of ordinary history at all. So Iliad Tempus, that time, it's not last year, it's not 1,000 years ago. It's a sacred time that exists outside our linear time, our calendar time altogether. So it's a time when the gods first acted and the world took its shape, but it is outside of our time. So it's almost like it's always happening. So to these societies, every meaningful thing that a person could do, whether you're marrying, building a house, planting a field, going to war, had what Eliade called an archetype. Don't get that confused with Jungian archetypes, which I also ascribe to. We could do a different episode. Think of the Eliade archetype as the template, right? The prototype, the first run of its kind, so to say, right? It's the first version of that act that was performed by a god or a divine ancestor back in Iliad Tempus, that time. That the human version was always, in some sense, repeating. So it's for man to have meaning, to for these actions to become meaningful, they would then need to replicate the first act in Iliad Tempus in that time that was performed by the gods or the ancestors, right? That's what I'm getting to. It could be strange if you've never been exposed to that. Let's continue on. So here's the part that's kind of hard for the modern mind to get their head wrapped around. So for archaic man or folks from these traditional societies, an act only became fully real once it repeated the original pattern. So plowing a field wasn't doing just agricultural labor. He was when the farmer went and plowed the field, he's repeating the act of the God who first broke open the earth. Right? A couple who was getting married wasn't just forming a household. They were reenacting a union that had already happened at the beginning, right? Between divine or cosmic figures. So ordinary time, you know, that you and I live in, where just one damn thing happens after the other, right? And decay, accident, and then becomes history, right? All that is treated as less real. What made an act matter was its connection back to the archetype, the divine, right? That's what gave it meaning. So Iliada even talks about like interviews of anthropologists with even like Aboriginal societies, where you just find this going on in the world over. And there's one place in the book, especially the book The Sacred and the Profane, where he talks about this tribesman that's a hunter, and he's talking about, when I go hunting, I become the fill in the blank god, whoever is the god of hunting in his tribal structure. He's not mimicking the god. He's not imitating the god. He's becoming the god. He's participating in that original divine act every time he picks up his spear or his bow and he goes out hunting, right? Hard for the modern mind to get its head around. That's something you got to let it soak and marinate for a while. And then you get closer to the truth the more you kind of peel back the layers. But he called this whole orientation the myth of the eternal return. And he argued that it served a real psychological function and not just a religious one. And he talked about how he called the terror of history, right? The anxiety that comes from living inside of pure, linear, unrepeatable time, right? Where things simply happen once and then they're gone. And there's no pattern holding any of it together, right? So ritual, in a sense, is the escape hatch from this. It's by reenacting this original act on purpose on a regular cycle, then the community could step outside of that frightening one directional flow of meaningless time and briefly renew themselves by standing back in that timeless moment when the world was first made, right? When the ground was first plowed, right? When the marital union was first formed. And so we still have carryovers of this, although it's been profaned greatly. But I mean, just think about New Year's Day, New Year's cycles, right? Things like where everybody wants a new slate, they want to start over again. It's a profane version of that, but you can see that even on a psychological view, the human psyche still has a need to try to get back to this. The fear that things have gone. In linear time, it's just too late, right? Things have gone on, and now we need a course correct. So they want a reset. They want to step back into the beginning. They want renewal. Even though now we just turn New Year's Eve into like a big reason to get drunk and kiss somebody under a mistletoe or something, or when the ball drops and stuff like that. We also, I think the modern world very much is still trapped in this fear of linear time, even though we probably wouldn't articulate it that way. I think just the way that we just spend hours of mindless distraction to get away from this world, right, in our own lives through doom scrolling and countless Netflix binging and things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with watching movies or anything, but just how people will just devote and piss away hours of their lives, which turn into years of their life, just in nothing, just to escape this idea of the present and of the now. Anyway, I'm drifting too far. You think about that, see where it takes you. But in here, when we get back to Iliada, so to say, right, the old year is symbolically dissolved back into chaos, and the original act of creation gets performed all over again to bring the world back into being for another cycle. And you're not just turning a calendar page, you're actually refighting the battle that made order possible in the first place. And this is where this connects directly what we're talking about. In a lot of these traditions, right, the founding battle, right, the warrior's battle is a warrior's battle, a god or hero physically fighting back the forces of chaos so that the order world can exist at all. So when you see these stories over and over again, usually it's like the striker god, which is the son of the Sky Father, fights the serpent, which is the embodiment of chaos, right, and destruction and entropy. That the strikers Like someone like Thor, right? His job is to force that back, to keep it at bay, to bring order to the universe against the chaotic and entropic forces. So when a Norse warrior or Germanic warrior was standing his ground in a battle, he wasn't just drawing on personal grit. On some level, inside that worldview, he's stepping back into the same act that Thor performed against the forces that want to unmake the world, right? So the fight wasn't just a metaphor for myth. The myth was the reason the fight had any weight beyond the immediate moment in the first place. And that is the piece that is genuinely hard, I think, for us modern folks to feel, because we don't live inside sacred time anymore. Very few of us even have a concept of what that is. This may be the first time you're hearing of it in the first place, so it may sound very alien to you, because we live inside history, right? The thing that Iliada said archaic man or traditional man was trying to get away from, right? But understanding that they weren't just telling stories about brave men, that they were locating human courage inside a pattern that they believed was woven into the cosmos itself. And that's the key that's going to unlock everything else in this episode, right? Because that means then that rituals were not just performance, it was participation. If you repeated the actions of the gods or that the ancestors took, you weren't you were lining yourself up with the same pattern that built reality in the first place. So think about it this way. The coronation wasn't just a ceremony representing a new king taking power. In their minds, it was a reenacting of the actual founding of kingship itself. So a harvest festival wasn't just marking the date on the calendar, right? It was renewing conditions that kept the world livable for another year. And so in that sense, the myth wasn't separate from life. It was the lens that you viewed life through. And that changes how we think about virtue in these cultures. Right? For us, virtue, when I said virtue, those things like honor, courage, fidelity, resilience, those kinds of things. So for us, virtue is usually a personal choice in the modern world. It's a trait that we decide is useful or admirable, right? Hey, honor, it's good to live by honor, right? It's good to be trusted by people, because if you're someone of high trust, right, good things happen to you. Discipline is good because it makes your life better, right? It helps you be more productive. It helps you achieve things, stuff like that. Sorry about that pause. One of my dogs started whining because she's missing her mama. So, my wife hadn't come back home yet. All right. God, where were we? Right. Yeah. So it changes how we think about virtue. Yeah, in the modern world, we just look at it as something that's useful, something that we want to emulate to make our lives better. But in the mythic framework, virtue works completely different. It's not something you pick. You don't decide to do it. You don't create it. You don't do it because you admire it. It's a way of plugging into something that already exists, whether you signed up for it or not. And that's why the warrior virtues keep showing up glued into myth, right? And I'm going to give you some examples of this, but courage and restraint and loyalty and endurance, not just good combat traits. They were expressions of something foundational, something the myth itself was pointing to as the actual structure of reality. And so that brings us to the next obvious question. If the virtues are modeled on something, modeled on who? Modeled on what? Who's actually demonstrating the pattern in these stories, right? So now it's time to meet the gods. If Iliada is right, if every meaningful human act in antiquity had some original version performed once by a god or an ancient ancestor back in Iliad Tempest, that is, quote, that time, unquote, right? A time outside of time, then myth isn't just a gallery of role models, is it? It's an archive for the prototype, for archetypes. The gods aren't held up to imitate wholesale the way that you would study a mentor, right? Like it's not just like a hero you would read about like George Washington and be like, man, that dude's a character. I want to model my life after him, which is a good pursuit. Don't get me wrong, but we're talking about something much deeper, something different. Most of them, but with these gods though, it does get a little complicated because if you look at their entire story, right, some of these gods would make challenging role models in the modern sense, right? And that's not a contradiction that we need to explain away because, because in some of these stories, the gods may be deceptive, they might be vindictive, may even be petty, jealous at times. Capricious and things like that. But there's a Roman philosopher back in the day named Sallust, who I'm a big fan of, writing centuries after these myths were already old. And he took on that question directly. And he said, what do you, and he addressed, what do you do with a myth when a god does something that just looks flat out wrong? And his answer was not to apologize for it. He said, you do the exact opposite. You don't run away from it. You get closer to it because the myths were never meant to be read as literal history in the first place. They're built to carry a truth, not record one. And the more shocking or the more strange that you find a god's behavior in myth that it looks like on the surface, and oftentimes some of these actions these gods would take would be taboo in the culture of the that participated in that religion where the myth was enshrined, by the way. Just like, for instance, the Germanic tribes had, right, they weren't about adultery or theft from those within their own tribe, things like that, things that you might see the gods do in their own religion. So that's why Sallust is so important here. So a strange one, like a god who lies, who breaks his word, who does something scandalous, right? That's the one that's built to make you stop and dig for what it's actually pointing at. So not going to tiptoe around that in any, just because it may be sensitive or it doesn't read clean for modern eyes, right? The stories are in there and they're supposed to be there. What we're looking for, what we're hunting for is not a claim that these gods were just, in the stories were just meant to be emulated across the board, but we're looking for specific acts that each story singles out that teaches us, particularly the one moment a culture pointed out and said, that's the pattern we need to step into. That's the thing we need to follow, right? That whole thing, I just had to do that Sallust stuff as an aside because especially if we have someone taking issue with this or someone who's a secularist or something, they'll look and that's one thing they like to do to throw shade is when you start steeping yourself in these stories, they like to point out the bad press, so to say, and they're fundamentally misreading the myth. They're misunderstanding it and misapplying it. And so I just wanted to address that. So I'm not going to go, maybe I'll do a whole episode on that, but right now that's kind of outside the scope. Let's get back to the Norse material because it makes this pattern easiest to see. So a quick primer, if you don't know this world at all, we're talking about pre-Christian religion of Scandinavia and the broader Germanic world. So there are the gods that you might recognize from the Marvel movies, but the Marvel movies and comic books are different. They're based on the myths. They do not follow the myth. Really, the real mythology is a lot stranger. It's a lot heavier, and quite frankly, more interesting than the movies let on. So that's what we're talking about. So try not to think about, if I talk about Thor, try not to think about Chris Hemsworth or Anthony Hopkins if we talk about Odin, right? We're talking much different. All right, let's move in. So Odin, like that is the chief god in this pantheon. He's a god of war, but much, much more. He's also, he's a figure that's defined by pursuit, and mainly the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge and understanding that never comes on the cheap. So for instance, in one story, right, he trades one of his eyes for a drink out of Mimir's well of wisdom, right? That he's willing to trade that part of himself to gain in wisdom, right? That's a pretty painful pursuit. And another one, he hangs himself voluntarily, deliberately on the world tree right? This Yggdrasil, this massive ash tree that in Norse cosmology says the whole universe is kept together. And he hangs on it for 9 days with no food, no water, just to gain knowledge of the runes. The runes are the an alphabet that the Germanics used to write with, but it's also a system of magic. He to gain the understanding of the runes and the primordial forces that they represent, that they are the key into, right? All of that, so he could gain that power. So he wanders the world often in disguise, and he trading his safety and status, right, as the Allfather, as the chief god of the pantheon, for insight that he couldn't get just by sitting at home. So his defining trait isn't domination, it's sacrifice. Sacrifice paid in exchange for deep understanding of the reality of nature. Let's move on to Thor, one of his sons. Thor is the striker god, right? He's the son of the Sky Father, so to say. So he fills that role. And he's one that most people already halfway know. Just like Odin, we get Wednesday from Woden's Day, Thor Thursday, Thor's Day, right? So we already use him. He's already enshrined in our vernacular every day, right? But he plays a different role that fits right alongside of Odin's. He's the protector. He's the one that holds the line against forces that basically want to unravel order entirely. And these forces are typically represented in the lore as giants, trolls, monsters, things like that represent chaos and entropy. So his strength is never framed as something that's just done for his own glory. Instead, it's pointed outward. He's keeping the world livable for you and me, right? For the folks here on Middle Earth, right? And his power means something because of what it's aimed at, not because of how much of it he has. If we move on to Tyr gives us maybe the sharpest example of all. There's a story in the lore where the gods need to bind this monstrous wolf named Fenrir, who's prophesied to eventually bring about the end of the world and the cosmos. And so by fitting him with a magical chain, right, or they want to kind of put him on a chain, basically, and Fenrir, who is no ordinary wolf, right, he's a magical wolf, I guess. He's no fool. He knows something's up. And so he tells the gods, he goes, hey, you can put this chain on me, but in order to show good faith, I want one of y'all to stick your hand in my mouth just to make sure everything's above board. And nobody's willing to take that on except for Tyr. So Tyr sticks his hands in the wolf's mouth. The wolf gets chained and he can't break free. And so as he has it, man, he clenches down and he bites Tyr's hand off, and Tyr loses a hand. And that's the whole trade. And the story doesn't frame this as like some flashy, sentimental sacrifice. It presents it as necessary. It's a costly, deliberate act that is taken to preserve order. Full stop. So if you put these three, and there's several others I could go into, but I'm not in this episode at least. But if you put these three side by side, and you don't separate the virtues, you start to get a pattern, right? Strength only matters when it's in service to order, right? Wisdom is inseparable from sacrifice. Right? You have to give something to gain wisdom, and oftentimes it's painful. Right? Honor is not just about your reputation, but it's about being willing to eat a real cost in order to keep a commitment. And this is where we've got to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and slow down, because the next part is the whole reason why I wanted to make this episode. So if these myths weren't just stories, but genuine frameworks for understanding reality, then imitating the figures isn't symbolic, right? It wasn't that a man looks at Tyr and is thinking, that's a good example. I need to be more like that. The way you would take a lesson from somebody's biography. It's something much stronger than that. To hold an oath at real cost, right? For a Norse tribesmen living inside this worldview wasn't just about, quote, doing the honorable thing, unquote. If we go back to Iliada, what I talked about Iliada, this Norseman would be participating then, right? When he took an oath and he held the oath, he is participating in the same act performed when Tyr put his hand in the wolf's mouth, right? He's not remembering it. He's not honoring it from a distance. He's actually stepping into the same pattern, the same current that Tyr did himself, right? When he moved through and bound Fenrir and held the world together. So the ritual and the myth weren't separate events, one ancient and one modern. In their minds, it was a continuous act. And the man practicing that virtue, right, maintaining his oath in that moment, was touching the same reality that the god Tyr touched. And that's genuinely strange. That's a strange ass claim by modern standards. And I don't want to sand the edges of it off and make it easier to swallow, right? It's very important you understand that they were not saying, quote, virtue is a good policy, end quote. Although it is a good policy, but that's not what they're saying. They're saying virtue, as far as the warrior goes, virtue is how you reach outside yourself and lay hold to something eternal, something real. And that holding your word, absorbing a cost, standing at your post was a man's one real avenue towards the divine. That is how you participate. For those on the warrior path back then, and I don't even think they would articulate it this way because it was just so ingrained in the cellular level. You can see it in their poems and in their literature and their acts, as they, gallivanted, raided, and dominated most of the known world. Right. But as is their avenue to participate in the divine. So courage, again, wasn't just a personality trait you were praised for having. It's a way that a man would step for a moment into the same order that the gods were bound by. And I want to be straight with you about something instead of hedging it. I'm not telling you this is just an interesting old framework that's worth appreciating from a distance. I think it's worth taking seriously on its own term. Maybe worth going back and actually tracing what your own ancestors held to, whoever they are. Like I told you, you will find these. I don't care what your ancestral lineage is. You will find this in just about any. I don't care what demographic you come from. If you trace it up far enough, you're going to find similar things. Like I said at the beginning. So whoever they were. And asking whether it deserves to be more than just a museum piece kind of respect. Because if you don't, you're going to, and you pursue this as a modern would, if you look at this through our modern lens, you're going to fall into exactly this trap. You're going to take something large and you're going to quietly flatten it into a life hack, right? Practice discipline because it's good for your mental health. True, probably, but that's not what these people believe that they were doing. And I think something gets lost the moment we translate their claim and make it into something that's a claim about ourselves, right? They weren't looking inward for the meaning. They were looking outward at something bigger than any one man and orienting their whole lives around getting close to it. Which leads to the question that's kind of been sitting underneath this whole episode is what happens when a civilization keeps admiring the warrior virtues long after it stopped believing in the myths that used to give those virtues their meaning and their power? Well, if we look at the pattern beneath the ethos, right, we started with the usual list, right? Courage, honor, discipline, and loyalty, without asking why it keeps showing up in these civilizations that never spoke to each other or may have had limited contact at best, right? The answer is the myth. The answer is their religion, right? Not as the myth, not as entertainment, but the actual structure that these people believed reality was built upon. Holding an oath wasn't just admirable. It was the same act that Tyr performed when he put his hands in the wolf's mouth to bind Fenrir. The myth wasn't decoration on behavior. It was the reason that the behavior mattered. And so In the modern world, we've kept the behavior, but we've lost the claim. And somewhere between then and now, the virtue stopped answering to something outside the man that was holding on to them, the gods, the fate, the order that he didn't invent, and started answering only to about how he feels about himself, how to be a better person. Like I said, the self-improvement / life hack avenue. And so going back to where we opened up, right? The lines that I quoted at first that sound so cool, right? That get a rise out of us, especially those of us on the warrior path, right? Though dying, an eagle should bear its claws. Fate will often spare a man if his courage holds, right? Nobody invented those out of nothing, the way that you'd write a slogan. Slogans may be a good word. Maybe that's the issue with the modern world, is that we look at these like slogans, right? And there's so much more than that. They're myth compressed. Odin's 9 days on Yggdrasil, Tyr's hand in the wolf's mouth, Thor fighting the Midgard serpent, right? Folded down into something that a man could say out loud right before he did something hard, something perilous, something costly. And if Iliade's right about what these people actually believed, then saying those words and meaning them wasn't decoration either. It was a way of stepping back into that time, into Iliad Tempest, back to the moment that the pattern first got laid down every single time. And that's the whole claim of this episode. Stated as plainly as I can, the warrior ethos didn't start with men deciding courage was a useful trait. It started outside men entirely. It starts in the gods, in fate, in an order that nobody in the world got to vote on. A Norseman holding his ground wasn't just expressing himself. He was reconnecting something bigger than himself in a way that the coronation reconnects to the first king, or a harvest festival reconnects to the first harvest. Virtue was a line running back to the divine. I'm going to say that again. The warrior virtues are a line that runs back from you to the divine, not a metaphor that I'm laying on after the fact, but the actual claim that these cultures back then made about themselves. Because here's what the modern world can't hand you, no matter how hard it tries. It can't give you that line back. Modern virtue, right, for its good, right, for the things of it that are positive, in the end, is still a closed loop. It starts inside the man and it ends inside the man. Discipline because it makes you happier or makes your life better. Courage because it helps build your confidence, right? Nothing wrong with wanting any of that. But notice which direction the arrow points. It starts with the self and returns to the self, right? Nobody outside of you is checking the math, right? For the ancients, the arrow pointed the other way. The virtue started outside the man, and in the gods, in the fates, in the religion, and only then maybe it arrived at him. That's not a small difference. That's the whole architecture running in reverse. So if you actually want the thing setting behind the checklist, and not everybody does, I get it. This is not for everybody. I totally understand that. But if you actually do want the thing setting behind the checklist, not just the discipline, not the confidence, but the thing itself, right? The way there was never through a self-help framework, right? It's through the old way, participation, not imitation, standing for a moment where the God once stood. Every time somebody told you courage, discipline, and loyalty are just practical tools, good for the mission, good for the team, good for getting through hard days, they're not wrong, right? They're just not telling you the whole story, because every one of those virtues is a line back, not a metaphor. It's an actual tested, thousands of years old line that men before you followed and found something bigger than themselves were on the other end. They found fate, the divine, the order underneath everything. Somewhere behind every man listening to this, whether you've ever asked it or not, there were people in your line who followed that line and built their entire lives around what they found there. And I think that's worth going back and actually finding. if we can, not just admiring it from a distance. That ultimately is what the warrior ethos is about. Not a checklist, but a line back to something that no man invented. Go and find it. All right, gang. That one's a deep one. I'm very interested in what you thought about that. It took me several goes. I've worked on this for months, and I really don't. I'll just put myself on blast. I don't feel like I really did it justice. It's very different. It's something, like I said, most of us probably haven't thought of or been exposed to, but that's something I have been wrestling with for years, and I feel like I'm closer to it, but nowhere has my journey ended. And so if you haven't, I would invite you to journey with me. Send me an email. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you thought about this episode. If you need clarity, if there's some maybe more nuanced subjects I could take with this as a springboard, right, for your own edification to help you out, let me know, and I'll do it. Until next time, I'm Mark signing off, telling you stay sharp and keep it pearl snapped.